I have seen people lose money in many ways. Some lose it through bad businesses. Some lose it through debt. Some lose it through vanity. Some lose it through impatience. But there is another way people lose wealth that is talked about far less, and in some cases it is more destructive than all the obvious mistakes combined. They expose it too early. They expose the number. They expose the plan. They expose the edge. They expose the inheritance. They even expose the good they do until generosity itself becomes performance. Most people think wealth is mainly a matter of acquiring capital. I do not think that is enough. Acquiring capital is only half the game. The other half is protecting the conditions under which capital can continue compounding. It requires boundaries, and one of the most underrated boundaries in financial life is informational. You do not owe the world a map to your balance sheet. You do not owe your friends a running commentary on your portfolio. You do not owe competitors a preview of your next move. You do not owe your children a spreadsheet of what they may inherit while you are still alive. And you certainly do not owe strangers a public performance of your virtue, just because you were decent enough to help someone quietly. I know this sounds severe to people who have been trained to treat openness as an automatic virtue, but money changes incentives. It changes what people notice. It changes what they ask for. It changes what they resent. It changes how they price. It changes how they wait. It changes how they judge. Once wealth becomes visible, relationships do not remain untouched. Markets do not remain untouched. Family systems do not remain untouched. Even your own motives do not remain untouched. That is why I think silence in the right places is not secrecy for its own sake. It is capital protection. The source document you gave me says this in a more theatrical style than I would use. It warns against revealing net worth. Next moves, your earning edge, your estate plan, and even your good deeds. It wraps that advice in the language of dark forests and predators. I would put it differently. I would say this: wealth attracts distortion. If you want to preserve clear incentives around your life, you must be very selective about what you reveal and when you reveal it. Let us start with the most obvious point. Never make your exact number part of ordinary conversation. I do not mean your accountant should not know. I do not mean your legal spouse should not know. I do not mean the people who must help you structure, protect, or transfer wealth should remain ignorant. I mean the rest of the world, friends, neighbors, extended family, acquaintances, the sort of people who say they are just curious, the sort of people who say they are happy for you, the sort of people who claim the number changes nothing. The number changes everything. The moment other people know your net worth, they stop relating to you as a peer and begin relating to you as a reservoir. If people believe you are roughly in the same economic category they are, then ordinary limits remain socially acceptable. You can say you do not want the expensive wine. You can say you do not want to lend money. You can say that a certain repair quote sounds too high. You can say you are not interested in financing someone else's idea. In all those cases, the no remains attached to judgment. But once the number becomes known, the same no is reinterpreted. It is no longer prudence. It becomes selfishness. It becomes stinginess. It becomes evidence that you could solve their problem, but chose not to. That change is subtle at first. Then it becomes constant. You do not get to decline dinner upgrade. You do not get to refuse loans without becoming the villain in somebody's private story. You do not get to negotiate hard without someone muttering that a rich man should stop worrying over a few $1,000s. This is why price discrimination matters far beyond economics textbooks. Once people know you are sitting on substantial money, they stop charging you for labor alone and start charging you a tax on perceived abundance. The contractor's quote changes. The business pitch changes. The social expectation changes. Information is leverage, and if you casually hand that leverage away, do not be surprised when the other side uses it. Most people think the danger of exposing wealth is envy. Envy is real, but it is not the main problem. The main problem is incentive distortion. That is a more serious thing. Envy may hurt your feelings. Distorted incentives bleed your capital for years, and this is not limited to money requests. It affects the tone of every interaction around decision making. Once the number is out, your life becomes publicly overexplained. Every refusal looks like moral failure. Every prudent choice looks like false scarcity. Every negotiation becomes harder because the other side assumes your ceiling is higher than your stated willingness. That is not just socially annoying, it is financially expensive. I have lived long enough to know that freedom is not merely the ability to buy what you want. Freedom is the ability to say no without entering a courtroom of public opinion. When too many people know your number, that freedom starts to narrow. That is why I would rather be underestimated than overexposed. The next thing you should keep quiet is your next move. This point matters in markets, in business, and in life. Generally, if you reveal your intention before your position is built, you are not being transparent. You are bidding against yourself. That principle extends beyond stocks. Suppose you are building a new business. Suppose you are buying land. Suppose you are assembling a position in a small company. Suppose you are moving cities. Suppose you are negotiating a sale. Suppose you are changing the structure of your life in a way that depends on time, quiet, and favorable terms. Why would you announce it before the thing is complete? What do you gain? Applause, validation, maybe a little excitement? And what do you risk? Competition, interference, second guessing, price pressure, bad advice. Jealousy disguised as caution. This is one of the easiest ways people destroy their own advantage. They confuse social sharing with progress. They talk as if motion itself deserves recognition. But an unfinished move is often weakest when it is most visible. Opportunities are often best when they are still ignored. Plans are often easiest to sabotage before they become facts. In that sense, silence is not mystery. It is incubation. A businessman who reveals every negotiation too early is not bold. He is sloppy. An investor who explains his thesis before he has finished building the position is not generous. He is inflating his own cost. A family that advertises every major change before the legal and financial work is done is not open. It is inviting friction. I have always preferred the opposite approach. Build first, talk later. In many cases, talk never. Now let me go one level deeper. Do not casually reveal your edge. This is different from your next move, though they are related. Your next move is what you are about to do. Your edge is why you tend to do well in the first place. That may be your method of buying businesses. It may be a niche you understand better than others. It may be a pricing model. It may be a sales process. It may be the way you think about tax structures. It may be the way you negotiate. It may be the way you concentrate your efforts where the odds are unusually favorable. Whatever it is, if it genuinely works, then it is a form of intellectual capital. And intellectual capital, once over-distributed, becomes less valuable. Good ideas spread. Once they spread, competition rises. Once competition rises, excess returns fall. The very act of making your edge public can reduce the future payoff of the edge itself. This is true in investing. It is true in business. It is true in career strategy, and it is true in personal habits. People love to tell themselves that sharing is always generous. Sometimes it is, but you should not confuse generosity with carelessness. A person who gives away the mechanism by which he creates value may discover that he has not demonstrated abundance. He has merely weakened his own economic position for the pleasure of appearing open. I have never believed in bragging about the goose that lays the eggs. Protect the goose. If you want to teach principles, teach principles. If you want to help people, help people. But there is a difference between transmitting wisdom and handing out your blueprint in full detail to anyone who happens to be standing nearby. Now we come to an area where money gets tangled with family, ego, guilt, and sentiment. Inheritance. This is one of the ugliest places where too much information can do real damage. People assume that because a family is close, full numerical transparency must be healthy. I do not agree. There is a great difference between reassuring your children that you have handled your affairs and giving them a detailed economic forecast of what they receive, and when, why. Because once the number is known, the inheritance stops being an abstract future contingency and starts becoming an active force in present behavior. That is dangerous. Children are not improved by having a detailed map of unearned rescue. They are improved by developing muscle, by taking risks, by building careers, by making mistakes that cost enough to teach but not enough to ruin them, by learning to hunt. If a child believes he is getting nothing, he tends to build a life as though he must stand on his own legs. If he knows the exact amount waiting for him, the inheritance begins exerting gravitational pull on his ambition. This is why Buffett's own philosophy has often been summarized in a line that still holds up very well. Leave your children enough so they can do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing. I have seen the opposite arrangement too many times. People spend years trying to protect their children from struggle and end up protecting them from character. That is a terrible trade. Unearned certainty has a narcotic effect. It reduces urgency. It changes risk appetite in the wrong direction. It makes waiting more attractive than building. Adults can become spiritually paused by a future inheritance they did not earn but fully expect. They are not hungry because the real test has been deferred. They become managers of anticipated wealth rather than creators of independent value. That is not how I would want to raise children. And there is another problem: family conflict. Inheritance numbers do not remain neutral inside a living family. Once known, they become measurements of love, worth, favor, grievance, duty, and resentment. If one child cared for you, if another child squandered money, if one child is disabled, if one child is independent, if one child has been responsible and another has not. Any unequal decision may be perfectly rational from your point of view, but from their point of view, it can easily become emotional evidence. They do not hear asset allocation, they hear parental judgment. And the more numerical detail you reveal while still alive, the more time you give that conflict to mature, harden, and infect relationships. A will should not become a season. Long sport, keep the structure handled, keep the details protected. Tell them you have taken care of things, that is often enough. Now let me turn to something more subtle, but in many ways just as dangerous. Do not publicize your good deeds. If your goodness depends on being seen, then your motive has already been diluted. This matters financially in two ways. First, public charity changes expectations. Once people think of you not as generous in principle, but as visibly generous in practice, the requests multiply, the pressure rises. The moral scripts become easier for others to deploy against you. Today's applause becomes tomorrow's entitlement. This is not because good deeds are bad. It is because publicity changes incentives. Second, performance corrupts character. If giving becomes a method of collecting status, then your internal compass starts drifting outward. You stop asking what is right. You start asking what will be noticed. There is a kind of private moral capital that gets built when you do decent things without trying to monetize them socially. That capital matters. It gives you independence from applause. Buffett has long talked about the inner scorecard and the outer scorecard. If you live by the outer scorecard, you are always handing the judging function to other people. That is not strength. It is dependence with better clothing. Money should reduce dependence, not create new forms of it. When charity becomes part of your identity performance, your giving stops being clean. It becomes a transaction with the crowd, and the crowd is never satisfied for long. So yes, help people, yes, give, yes, act decently, but do not confuse public narration with virtue. A quiet, decent act often does more good for the soul than a loud, charitable act that exists partly to feed the actor. At this point, some people become uncomfortable. They hear this kind of advice and assume it means paranoia or coldness. They think it means viewing all relationships through the lens of threat. That is not what I am saying. I am saying that money changes incentives whether you acknowledge it or not, and mature adults should know that. You do not have to believe everyone is malicious to recognize that everyone responds to incentives. You do not have to assume every friend is a parasite to understand that some friendships become harder to preserve when the money gap becomes public and specific. You do not have to assume every child is corrupt to know that a guaranteed inheritance can soften urgency and twist family dynamics. You do not have to think every contractor is dishonest to know that disclosed abundance changes negotiation. You do not have to think every good deed will become vanity to know that public recognition can contaminate motive. This is simply how human beings work. That is why silence matters. Silence preserves equality where possible. Silence preserves leverage. Silence preserves room to say no. Silence preserves price discipline. Silence preserves edge. Silence preserves family peace. Silence preserves hunger in the next generation. Silence preserves the inner scorecard. In that sense, informational boundaries are not antisocial. They are pro-compounding. They reduce friction. They reduce noise. They reduce moral theater. They reduce the number of people who feel entitled to vote on your life. Wealth grows best where unnecessary friction is low. Every demand, every plea, every guilt campaign, every distorted quote, every jealous comment disguised as prudence, every social audit of your spending, all of it is friction. Most people focus on financial return and forget that social friction can be just as corrosive to long-term wealth as taxes and fees. So if you want the cleanest summary of my view, it is this. Do not turn your wealth into public property before it becomes legal property for someone else. Do not narrate your strategy before the position is built. Do not advertise the mechanism that gives you economic advantage. Do not give children numbers that may weaken the muscle you are trying to leave them. Do not let generosity become performance. None of this is about acting mysterious. It is about acting intelligently. A man who keeps certain things private is not necessarily secretive. Often he is simply refusing to make his life more expensive than it needs to be. The world already creates enough friction for anyone trying to invest, negotiate, build, save, and compound. Why volunteer for more? Why add audience pressure where none is needed? Why make every personal decision legible to people who bear no cost when they are wrong? Why invite claimants into spaces where no claimant had a right to stand? This is why I have never admired financial exhibitionism. It creates the wrong incentives in the people around you. And if practiced long enough, it creates the wrong incentives in you. A quieter life may look less exciting from the outside. From the inside, it often feels much stronger. The people who endure, in my experience, are not always the loudest, the flashiest, or the most constantly admired. Often they are the ones who know what must remain unannounced until the work is done. They know the difference between being seen and being secure. They know the difference between being praised and being protected. They know the difference between a conversation and a leak. And they understand, sometimes earlier than others do, that protecting wealth is not only about earning returns on capital, it is also about defending the informational environment in which those returns can keep accumulating. That environment is fragile. Guard it carefully.